He thought he was rejecting a nobody, but in less than 10 minutes, he would wish he had never opened his mouth. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state below, and if you believe respect should never depend on appearances, stay with this story. The morning sun spilled across the polished glass walls of the dealership, reflecting rows of luxury cars lined up like sculptures, each worth more than most homes, engines silent but powerful, waiting for the right owner to claim them. Inside, the air carried a quiet confidence, the kind that came with tailored suits, expensive watches, and conversations about investments measured in 6 and 7 figures. And then, the door opened. Emily Carter stepped in quietly, her sneakers soft against the marble floor, her outfit simple, a plain white t-shirt and faded jeans, nothing about her announcing wealth, nothing about her asking for attention. But her eyes moved differently, steady, observant, as if she belonged anywhere she chose to stand. Across the showroom, Blake Thompson adjusted his navy suit jacket and noticed her immediately. Years in sales had trained him to read people within seconds, to separate real buyers from dreamers, and to him, Emily fell into the latter category. His lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, more like quiet amusement. He didn't rush to greet her. Instead, he let a younger associate take a step forward before subtly intercepting, placing himself between Emily and the vehicle she was looking at. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone polished but distant, the kind of politeness that kept people at arm's length. Emily gave a small, calm smile. "Yes, I was interested in that coupe over there," she said, nodding toward a midnight blue car displayed under soft lighting, its price tag just under $300,000. Blake followed her gaze, then looked back at her, his expression tightening just enough to reveal his judgment. "That model is typically reserved for serious buyers," he replied, his voice lowering slightly, as if explaining something obvious. "We usually schedule private viewings in advance." The words were smooth, but the meaning was clear. Around them, a couple browsing nearby slowed their steps, curiosity flickering in their eyes. Emily didn't react. She simply nodded once, absorbing the tone, the implication, the quiet dismissal. "I understand," she said softly. But Blake wasn't finished. Confidence had a way of growing when it faced no resistance. "If you're just looking around," he added, gesturing casually toward the far end of the showroom, "we have more accessible options in our pre-owned section. You might find something that fits better." The sentence landed heavier than he intended, or perhaps exactly as he intended. A faint murmur passed through the room. Someone let out a small, awkward laugh. Emily's fingers tightened slightly at her sides, but her face remained composed, her eyes steady, revealing nothing. She glanced once more at the car, then back at Blake, as if memorizing the moment. "Thank you," she said quietly. No argument. No embarrassment. Just quiet acceptance. And that, more than anything, made Blake certain he had been right. She turned and walked toward the exit, her footsteps measured, unhurried, the sunlight catching her silhouette as the glass doors opened again. Behind her, the showroom returned to its rhythm, conversations resuming, the illusion of normalcy settling back in. But near the entrance, something shifted. A reflection appeared first, dark and sleek against the glass. Then the low, unmistakable presence of a Rolls-Royce gliding into view, its polished surface capturing every eye in the room without a single sound. One by one, heads turned. Conversation stopped. The room went still. And just as the engine settled into silence, the rear door began to open. The door of the Rolls-Royce opened with quiet precision, and a man stepped out in a tailored charcoal suit that fit him with effortless authority, his presence commanding attention without a single word, and in that instant the entire showroom seemed to shift as if the air itself had changed direction, conversations dissolved into silence and even the faint hum of the building felt distant, because people recognized him before they even realized why. Daniel Carter did not rush, he never did. His movements, measured, deliberate, each step across the pavement echoing with a quiet confidence that only came from someone who did not need to prove anything to anyone. Inside the showroom, Blake Thompson straightened instinctively, his posture snapping into something far more attentive than before. The same man who moments ago had dismissed Emily now felt a flicker of uncertainty rise in his chest. Because something about this arrival did not fit the narrative he had already decided, Daniel's eyes lifted and found Emily standing just outside the entrance, her figure calm against the sunlight, and for a brief moment the world narrowed to just the two of them. He gave a small nod, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just enough to acknowledge her presence, and Emily returned it with the same quiet composure, as if everything unfolding was exactly as expected. Then Daniel's gaze shifted, slowly, deliberately, toward the interior of the showroom, toward Blake, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop without anyone understanding why. A young associate near the front desk whispered under his breath, "That is Daniel Carter," and the name moved through the room like a ripple across still water, subtle at first, then undeniable. Blake felt it hit him a second later, recognition landing hard, his mind racing through headlines, business articles, private client lists, and then the realization settled fully, unmistakably. The man walking toward him was not just wealthy, he was power, the kind of power that shaped deals, that owned companies, that decided who stayed and who disappeared quietly from positions like his. Blake swallowed, forcing a smile that suddenly felt too tight on his face, as Daniel stepped through the glass doors and into the polished showroom, his shoes making a soft, steady sound against the marble floor, each step louder than it should have been in the silence. Emily remained just behind him, not hiding, not stepping forward, simply watching, her expression unchanged, as if she had already seen this moment play out in her mind. Daniel stopped a few feet from Blake, close enough to command the space, but not close enough to invade it, his eyes steady, unreadable. And for a second Blake opened his mouth to speak, to recover, to reshape the situation into something manageable, but the words did not come out the way he planned. "Sir, I did not realize," he began, his voice catching just slightly, and that was all it took, that single fracture in his composure revealing everything. Daniel tilted his head just a fraction, not confused, not impressed, simply observing, as if evaluating a detail that had already been decided. Around them the staff stood frozen, customers pretending not to watch but unable to look away, the weight of the moment pressing down on every person in the room. And then Daniel finally spoke, his voice calm, controlled, carrying easily across the silence without ever needing to rise. "You did not realize what?" he asked, and the question hung there, simple, direct, impossible to escape. Blake felt the heat rise in his face, every word he had said earlier replaying in his mind with brutal clarity, every glance, every dismissive gesture, now exposed under a light he could not turn off. And behind Daniel, Emily took one small step forward, her presence quiet but undeniable, and in that moment Blake understood something that came far too late. He had not just misjudged a customer, he had misjudged the entire situation, and there was no way to rewind what had already been set in motion. The room held its breath, waiting for what would happen next, because whatever came now would not be about a car, it would be about something far more permanent, something that could not be undone once spoken. Blake's throat tightened as the question lingered in the air, simple yet devastating, because there was no answer that could undo what had already been done, no explanation that could rewrite the last 10 minutes, and for the first time in a long while, he felt completely unprepared, his usual confidence slipping through his fingers as every pair of eyes in the showroom remained fixed on him, waiting, judging, measuring, the same way he had measured Emily just moments before. I did not realize she was with you," Blake finally managed, the words sounding smaller than he intended, and the moment they left his mouth, he knew they were wrong. Daniel's expression did not change, not even slightly, but something in his gaze sharpened, as if that single sentence had revealed more than Blake understood. "With me," Daniel repeated calmly, his voice even, controlled, and somehow heavier than before, and the silence that followed felt thicker, almost tangible, pressing against the walls of the room. Emily stood just behind him, her posture relaxed, her face composed, not triumphant, not angry, just quietly present, as if she had already detached herself from the need for validation, and that, more than anything, unsettled Blake, because there was no emotion to negotiate with, no reaction to soften, just the quiet certainty of someone who knew exactly who they were. Daniel took a small step forward, closing the distance just enough to shift the balance of the space, not aggressively, not confrontationally, but with the kind of authority that did not need to raise its voice. "So if she was not with me," he continued, his tone steady, "then your behavior would have been acceptable." The question landed with precision, cutting through any attempt at recovery, and Blake froze, his mind searching for a response that would not make things worse. but finding none, because the truth was already exposed, laid bare in front of everyone. A young associate near the desk looked down, unable to watch, while a couple standing near the sports cars exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of the moment settling over the entire showroom. Daniel's gaze did not waver. He was not angry, not loud, not theatrical, but there was something far more unsettling in his composure, something that made it clear that this was not about emotion, this was about principle. Emily shifted slightly, stepping closer now, her presence aligning beside Daniel rather than behind him, and for the first time, Blake truly looked at her, not at her clothes, not at her appearance, but at her, and what he saw made his stomach drop. There was no uncertainty in her eyes, no hesitation, only quiet confidence, the kind that does not come from wealth alone, but from knowing your own worth regardless of who recognizes it. Daniel turned his head. Just enough to acknowledge her, a subtle gesture, but one that carried meaning. Then he looked back at Blake. She came here as a customer, he said simply. That should have been enough, each word deliberate, measured, impossible to argue with. Blake opened his mouth again, but no sound came out, because there was nothing left to defend. The logic was undeniable, the failure obvious, and the consequences beginning to take shape in ways he could not yet fully see. Across the room, the dealership owner had appeared, drawn by the silence and the unmistakable presence of a situation spiraling beyond control, his expression shifting rapidly as he recognized Daniel, his steps quickening, urgency replacing confidence. But before he could speak, before he could attempt to smooth over what had already been broken, Daniel raised a hand slightly, not to stop him aggressively, but enough to signal that the moment belonged to him, and the owner halted instinctively, the entire room now suspended in a single, fragile pause, and then Daniel spoke again, quieter this time, but somehow even more powerful. Respect is not a luxury item, he said, his voice steady, carrying through the silence. It does not come with a price tag, and it should not depend on who walks through your door. The word settled over the room like a verdict, final, unshakable, and in that moment, no one moved, no one spoke, because everyone understood that something irreversible had just happened. Not loud, not explosive, but undeniable, and Blake stood there, the weight of it pressing down on him, realizing far too late that the mistake he made was not about a sale, it was about something much bigger, something that could not be corrected with an apology alone, and the room remained silent. The silence did not break, it stretched, deepened, until it felt like the entire showroom was holding its breath, waiting to see who would move first, and it was not Blake. He remained frozen in place, his polished confidence now reduced to hesitation, his carefully practiced demeanor unraveling under the weight of a moment he could not control, and across from him Daniel Carter simply stood, calm, composed, as if time itself bent slightly around him, not rushing, not pressing, because he did not need to. The truth had already been spoken, and everyone in the room had heard it. The dealership owner finally stepped forward again, slower this time, more cautious, his usual authority replaced with something closer to concern. "Mr. Carter," he began, his voice measured, attempting to reclaim some sense of order. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding." But even as he spoke, the words felt hollow, because the room itself rejected them, the tension too real to be dismissed with polite language. Daniel turned his gaze toward him, not dismissive, not hostile, but steady, evaluating, and for a brief moment the owner faltered, realizing that this was not a situation that could be smoothed over with practiced phrases. Emily remained beside Daniel, her presence quiet but anchoring, her eyes moving across the showroom, taking in the staff who now avoided her gaze, the customers who had witnessed everything, the same people who had watched her be dismissed minutes earlier, and there was no anger in her expression, only a quiet clarity, as if the moment had revealed something she had always known. Daniel spoke again, his tone unchanged. "A misunderstanding suggests confusion," he said calmly, but there was no confusion here. The owner nodded slowly, unable to argue, because the truth of it was undeniable. The sequence of events too clear, too public. Blake shifted his weight slightly, as if trying to regain balance. "I apologize," he said, the words coming quickly now, urgency replacing arrogance. "I made an incorrect assumption." But even as he spoke, the apology felt incomplete, because it addressed the outcome, not the behavior, and Daniel noticed, of course he did, his eyes narrowing just slightly, not in anger, but in recognition. "You did not make an incorrect assumption," Daniel replied, his voice still even. "You made a deliberate judgment, and the distinction landed with precision, sharper than any raised voice could have been." Blake's shoulders lowered, the reality settling in fully now, because there was no argument left, no angle to recover from, only the truth. standing in front of him, undeniable, unchangeable. The owner glanced at Blake, then back at Daniel, understanding the gravity of what was unfolding, not just in terms of reputation, but in something deeper, something that could not be measured in sales numbers or client lists. Emily finally spoke, her voice soft but clear, cutting through the tension in a way that surprised everyone. "I came here to buy a car," she said simply, her words carrying no bitterness, no accusation, just a statement of fact, and yet it echoed louder than anything else that had been said, because it stripped everything down to its simplest form: a customer, a transaction, a moment that should have been ordinary, and instead had become something else entirely. Daniel glanced at her, a subtle acknowledgement, then looked back at the owner. "That opportunity is gone," he said, not harshly, not dramatically, just as a matter of fact. And the finality of it settled over the room like a closing door. The owner nodded slowly, understanding that no discount, no gesture, no apology would restore what had been lost. Blake's gaze dropped to the floor, the weight of consequence now fully visible in his posture, not imposed, not announced, but inevitable, and around them the showroom remained silent. The polished cars, the gleaming surfaces, the symbols of wealth and status now reduced to a backdrop for something far more significant, something that could not be bought or displayed. And as Daniel turned slightly, preparing to leave, he paused for just a fraction of a second, his voice low but clear enough for everyone to hear. "The way you treat someone when you think they have nothing," he said, "that tells you everything about what you really have." And then he stepped away, Emily following beside him, not behind, not ahead, but equal, their footsteps steady as they moved toward the exit, leaving behind a room that no longer felt the same, a room that had just witnessed something it would not forget. And as the glass doors opened once more, the silence remained, heavier now, because everyone understood that the lesson had already been delivered, and there was nothing left to say. The glass doors closed behind them with a soft, almost inaudible sound, but inside the showroom, it echoed louder than anything that had happened before, because what remained was not just silence, it was realization, and no one moved for several seconds, as if the entire space needed time to catch up with what had just unfolded. Blake stood exactly where he had been, his reflection faintly visible in the polished surface of a nearby car, but for the first time, he did not recognize the man looking back at him. The confidence was gone, replaced by something unfamiliar, something heavier, and across the room the owner exhaled slowly, running a hand across his tie as he tried to process the situation, his eyes shifting from the exit to Blake, then to the staff, all of whom now avoided his gaze. The atmosphere had changed completely, not because of anger, not because of raised voices, but because of something far more difficult to repair: credibility, trust, the unspoken understanding of how people were treated within those walls. A young associate finally broke the stillness, stepping forward hesitantly. "Sir," he began, but stopped, unsure of what to say, because there were no instructions for moments like this, no training manual that explained how to recover from a mistake that had exposed more than just poor judgment. The owner turned toward Blake fully now, his expression no longer uncertain, but firm, measured. "Step into my office," he said quietly, not loud enough to draw attention, but strong enough that everyone heard it anyway. Blake nodded, unable to meet his eyes, and followed, each step heavier than the last, the door closing behind them with a muted click, leaving the rest of the showroom suspended in an uneasy calm. Conversations did not resume immediately. Customers lingered, some pretending to browse, others openly watching, as if hoping to understand what they had just witnessed, because it had not been dramatic in the usual sense, no shouting, no scene, and yet it felt more significant than any confrontation could have been. Outside, the Rolls-Royce pulled away smoothly, disappearing into the flow of traffic as if it had never been there, and inside the car, Emily sat quietly beside Daniel, her gaze drifting out the window, the city moving past in soft reflections. For a moment neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything had already been said. Finally Daniel glanced at her, his voice calm. "Are you all right?" he asked, and Emily gave a small nod, her expression thoughtful rather than shaken. "I am," she replied softly, then after a brief pause she added, "I have seen that look before." Daniel understood immediately. He did not need to ask what she meant, because it was not about one showroom, one manager, or one moment. It was about something deeper, something that existed in quiet judgments and unspoken assumptions, the kind that revealed themselves in small interactions long before they became obvious. "It is easy to treat people well when you believe they matter," Emily continued, her voice steady. "The real test is how you treat them when you think they do not." Daniel nodded slightly, her words aligning with everything that had just happened, and yet carrying more weight because they came without anger, without resentment, just clarity. The car moved forward through the city streets, steady, uninterrupted, and behind them, back at the dealership, the door to the owner's office opened again. Blake stepped out slowly, his posture different now, subdued, not broken, but changed. The staff looked at him briefly, then away, unsure how to react. Unsure what came next. The owner remained inside, his silhouette visible through the glass, already on the phone, his expression serious, decisive, because there were consequences that extended beyond a single employee, beyond a single interaction. This was about the standard the entire place would now be measured against. Blake stood there for a moment longer, taking in the showroom, the same space that had once felt like a place of control, now unfamiliar, almost distant. And in that quiet moment, something settled within him, not the kind of realization that arrives loudly, but the kind that lingers, that stays, that changes the way you see every interaction that follows, because some lessons do not need to be repeated to be remembered. And as the staff slowly returned to their roles, the room never quite returned to what it had been before. Something invisible had shifted, something that could not be reset, only carried forward, and somewhere in the distance, the city continued moving, unaware that inside one showroom, a simple moment had quietly redrawn the line between status and respect. The city moved on as if nothing had happened, traffic lights changing, people crossing streets, conversations continuing in quiet fragments, but inside the car, something had shifted in a way that did not fade as quickly. Emily rested her hand lightly against the window, watching the reflections of buildings slide past, her expression calm, yet thoughtful, as if replaying the moment not with anger, but with clarity. Daniel glanced at her again, then forward, his voice steady. "Do you want me to call them?" he asked, not as a command, not even as a suggestion, but as an option, the kind that came with influence, with the ability to change outcomes with a single decision. Emily shook her head gently, her eyes still on the passing city. "No," she said softly, "it is already done," and there was something in the way she said it that made it clear she did not mean the sale, she meant the lesson, the exposure, the moment that had revealed more than any consequence ever could. Daniel nodded once, understanding, because he had seen this before, not in her, but in the world, the quiet moments where people revealed who they were when they believed no one important was watching, and those were the moments that mattered most. The car slowed as they approached an intersection, sunlight catching briefly on the dashboard, and Emily let out a small breath, almost a release. "When I walked in there," she said, her voice measured, "I already knew how it would go." Daniel turned slightly, not surprised, but curious. "You did?" he asked, and Emily nodded, finally shifting her gaze from the window to him. "Not exactly how," she clarified, "but I have learned to recognize the look." She paused, choosing her words carefully, the kind that decides your worth before you say a single word. Daniel's expression softened just slightly, not out of sympathy, but out of recognition, because he had seen it too, in different forms, in different rooms, but always rooted in the same assumption. The car moved forward again, smooth and uninterrupted, and Emily continued, her tone steady. "The truth is, I was not upset when he dismissed me," she said, and Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly, listening closely. "I was curious," she added, and that word hung in the air. "Unexpected, curious," he repeated, and she nodded. "Curious to see how far it would go," she explained, "how much a person is willing to reveal about themselves when they believe there are no consequences." Daniel let out a quiet breath, a faint smile forming, not amused, but impressed, because that perspective required a kind of restraint most people did not have. "And now you know," he said, and Emily gave a small, knowing smile. "Yes," she replied, "and so do they." Back at the dealership, the atmosphere had not returned to normal, not fully. Staff moved more carefully, voices lower, interactions more deliberate, as if everyone had become aware of something they could no longer ignore. The owner stood near the front, speaking quietly with a senior associate, his tone firm but controlled, outlining changes that would not be written down but would be understood, expectations reset not through policy, but through presence. Blake remained at the edge of the showroom, not engaging, not directing, simply observing, his role suddenly unclear, his certainty gone, and in that space, something uncomfortable but necessary began to take shape. Reflection, not forced, not immediate, but inevitable. A customer approached him cautiously, asking about a vehicle, and for a brief second Blake hesitated, then responded differently, his tone measured, attentive, stripped of assumption, as if rebuilding something from the ground up. The moment small, almost unnoticeable, but significant in a way that could not be measured. Outside, the day continued, ordinary in every visible way, but somewhere within it, a line had been redrawn, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly, and inside the car, as they turned onto a quieter street, Emily leaned back slightly, her expression at ease now, the weight of the moment behind her. Daniel glanced at her once more, then back at the road, and neither of them needed to say anything else, because the lesson had already been delivered, not through force, not through confrontation, but through something far more lasting. And as the car disappeared into the flow of the city, the quiet truth of that moment remained, unseen, but not forgotten. The following morning arrived quietly, without announcement, without spectacle, but inside the dealership, nothing felt the same. The marble floors still gleamed under the overhead lights, the cars still stood in perfect formation, polished and untouched, but there was a subtle shift in the way people moved, in the way voices carried, in the way glances lingered just a second longer than before, as if everyone had become aware of something invisible that could no longer be ignored. Blake arrived earlier than usual, his steps slower, more deliberate, no longer carrying the easy confidence that had once defined him. He paused just inside the entrance, taking in the showroom as if seeing it for the first time. The same space that had once felt like his domain now felt unfamiliar, almost reflective, and for a moment he stood there, silent, before straightening his jacket and stepping forward. A young associate greeted him cautiously, their tone respectful but measured, and Blake returned the greeting in kind, his voice softer, stripped of the edge it once carried, the change subtle, but undeniable. Across the room the owner stood near the center, speaking with two senior staff members, his posture firm, his tone controlled, outlining expectations that did not need to be written down, because everyone already understood what had changed. It was not about policy, it was about perception, about awareness, about the understanding that every interaction now carried weight. Blake approached slowly, stopping just short of the group, waiting, something he would not have done before, and when the owner turned to him, there was no anger in his expression, only clarity. "Good morning," the owner said evenly, and Blake nodded. "Good morning," he replied, his voice steady, but quieter than usual. The owner studied him for a brief moment, then spoke. "We are not in the business of deciding who deserves respect," he said, his words measured, deliberate, echoing something that had been said the day before, but now carried a different kind of authority. Blake held his gaze, not defensive, not resistant, just listening, truly listening. "Every person who walks through that door is a customer," the owner continued, "and more importantly, they are a reflection of who we are when no one is watching." The room seemed to still slightly, the weight of the statement settling over those nearby. Blake nodded once, slowly, because there was nothing to argue, nothing to explain, only something to understand, and that understanding came with a quiet acceptance, not of blame, but of responsibility, the kind that does not fade with time, but stays, shaping every decision that follows. The morning progressed. Customers entered. Conversations resumed, but there was a noticeable difference in the tone, in the attention given, in the absence of assumption. Blake moved through the showroom differently now, his approach more intentional, his questions more open, his focus no longer on quick judgment, but on listening, truly listening, and with each interaction, something shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, steadily, like a pattern being rewritten. A woman entered mid-morning, dressed simply, her posture reserved. And for a brief moment, the old instinct flickered, the quick assessment, the silent categorization, but this time, Blake paused, just for a second, and in that pause, something changed. "Good morning," he said, stepping forward, his tone respectful, genuine. "How can I help you today?" And the difference was immediate, not just in his words, but in the way they were received, because respect, when offered without condition, carries a weight that cannot be imitated. Across the showroom, the owner watched quietly, not intervening, not correcting, simply observing, because the lesson had already been delivered, and now it was being applied, not through pressure, but through choice. Outside, the city moved as it always did, unaware of the quiet transformation taking place inside those glass walls, and somewhere beyond it, Emily and Daniel continued their day, unchanged in appearance, unchanged in routine, but leaving behind something that lingered, something that could not be seen, but could be felt in every interaction that followed. And as the sunlight shifted across the showroom floor, reflecting off the polished surfaces, there was a new kind of stillness in the air, not the silence of tension, but the silence of awareness, and in that space, something subtle but powerful had taken root. the understanding that respect was never about who someone appeared to be, but about who you chose to be when you met them. 3 days later, the dealership no longer felt like the same place, not because the cars had changed or the lighting had shifted, but because the people inside it carried themselves differently, as if an invisible standard had been raised and everyone could feel it. Conversations were more attentive, gestures more deliberate, and assumptions, once automatic, now hesitated before forming. Blake stood near the center of the showroom, speaking with a middle-aged man in work boots and a worn jacket, the kind of customer he might have overlooked before without a second thought, but now he listened closely, nodding as the man explained what he needed, asking questions not to qualify him, but to understand him, and when the man smiled, a genuine, appreciative smile, it lingered longer than any sale Blake had made that week. Across the room the owner observed quietly, his expression neutral but his eyes attentive, not looking for perfection, but for awareness, for the shift that mattered more than any policy ever could, and for the first time in a long while, he saw it taking root, not just in Blake, but in the entire staff. A young associate approached a woman browsing near the entrance, offering help without hesitation, without judgment, and the woman's posture relaxed instantly, the tension that often accompanied uncertainty dissolving before it could even take shape. Outside, a familiar low hum approached, subtle but unmistakable, and though no one had been told, several heads turned toward the glass doors, as if the memory of that sound had been etched into the space itself. A black Rolls-Royce came into view once again, gliding to a smooth stop in front of the dealership, and this time, there was no confusion, no hesitation, just awareness. The room quieted, not out of fear, but out of recognition. The door opened, and Daniel Carter stepped out, his presence the same as before, calm, composed. But today there was no tension following him. Only curiosity. He walked toward the entrance, his pace steady, and beside him, Emily stepped out as well, dressed just as simply as before, her expression unchanged, her presence quiet but grounded. The doors opened, and as they entered, something subtle but powerful happened. Blake moved first, not out of obligation, not out of fear, but out of intention. He approached them with a calm, respectful demeanor, stopping at a comfortable distance, his posture open, his tone steady. "Good morning," he said, his voice sincere, without any trace of the person he had been days ago. "Welcome back." The words were simple, but they carried weight, because they were real. Emily met his gaze, studying him for a brief moment, not searching for perfection, but for honesty, and what she saw was enough. She gave a small nod, acknowledging the effort, the change, the understanding that had taken root. Daniel watched the exchange quietly, saying nothing, because nothing needed to be said. The moment spoke for itself. Blake gestured toward the showroom. "If you are still interested, I would be happy to assist you," he added, his tone measured, not assuming, not pushing, simply offering, and for a brief second, the room held still again, but this time, it was different. It was not the silence of tension, it was the silence of something being restored. Emily glanced at Daniel, then back at Blake, and for the first time since she had walked into that showroom, a faint smile touched her lips. Not dramatic, not triumphant, just quiet. "Genuine, I am," she said softly, and in that moment, the entire room seemed to breathe again, not because a sale might happen, but because something far more important had been proven, not through words, not through consequences, but through change, real, visible change. And as Blake stepped aside, guiding them toward the car she had first pointed to days earlier, the polished surface of the showroom reflected something new, not just wealth, not just status, but something that could not be bought, something that had to be chosen. And for the first time since that morning, the space felt complete again. Not because nothing had happened, but because what had happened had finally meant something. The soft click of the car door echoed gently as Emily stepped inside the midnight blue coupe she had first noticed days ago, her hand gliding across the leather interior, not with excitement, but with quiet appreciation, as if the moment was not about the car itself, but everything that had led to it. Blake stood a respectful distance away, his posture composed, his presence attentive without being intrusive, answering her questions with clarity and patience, each word measured, each gesture intentional, and there was no trace of the man who had once dismissed her, only someone who had learned, truly learned, what it meant to see beyond the surface. Daniel remained nearby, observing, silent but present, his expression calm, because this was no longer about intervention, it was about witnessing change unfold naturally. Emily looked up from the dashboard, meeting Blake's eyes for a brief moment, and in that exchange, something passed between them, not forgiveness spoken aloud, not apology repeated, but understanding, the kind that does not need words. "It feels right," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough for Blake to hear, and he nodded, a small, genuine acknowledgement, not of the sale, but of the moment. Paperwork was handled efficiently, without urgency, without pressure, the process unfolding as it should have from the beginning, and when the final signature was placed, it did not feel like a transaction completed, but like a balance restored. Outside, the sun had shifted slightly, casting a warmer light across the dealership, reflecting off the glass and polished surfaces, and as the car was prepared, a small group of staff gathered at a distance, not out of obligation, but out of quiet curiosity, because they understood they were witnessing something rare, not the purchase of a luxury vehicle, but the result of a lesson that had taken root. Blake stepped forward once more, handing Emily the keys with steady hands, his voice calm. "Thank you for your trust," he said, and the words carried weight, because they were no longer part of a script, they were earned. Emily accepted the keys, her fingers closing around them, and for a brief moment, she paused, looking at him, truly looking, as if recognizing the effort behind the change. "Thank you for seeing me," she replied softly, and the simplicity of that sentence settled over the room with quiet power, because it was never about the car, never about the price, it was about being seen, about being acknowledged without condition. Daniel opened the passenger door for her, his gesture subtle, respectful, and as she settled into the driver's seat, he walked around to join her. The engine started with a smooth, controlled hum, the kind that did not need to announce itself to be understood. Blake stepped back, watching as the car moved slowly toward the exit, his reflection briefly visible in its polished surface. But this time, the man he saw looking back was different, not defined by what he had lost, but by what he had learned. The glass doors opened once more, and as the car rolled out into the sunlight, the room remained still. Not out of tension, but out of respect, and when the doors closed again, the silence that followed was no longer heavy, it was calm, settled, as if something had finally found its place. The owner stood quietly at the back, observing, saying nothing, because nothing needed to be said. The standard had been set, not by rules, not by enforcement, but by a single moment that had revealed everything, and as the staff slowly returned to their roles, there was a quiet understanding shared among them. Something that would not fade with time, something that would shape every interaction moving forward. Outside, the car merged into the flow of the city, indistinguishable from the world around it, and inside, Emily drove with the same calm confidence she had always carried, Daniel beside her, silent but present, and neither of them needed to revisit what had happened, because its meaning was already clear. And somewhere behind them, in a showroom filled with symbols of wealth, something far more valuable had been left behind, not seen, not displayed, but remembered. And that day, without announcement, without spectacle, the world had quietly been reminded what dignity looks like.